From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Tracy Grant. I'm the editor of Kids Post at the Washington Post. I'm so thrilled that all of you came to see me today. I do want to welcome you to the National Book Festival. The Washington Post is a proud charter sponsor, and this is a particular thrill for me. I don't know that Lois Lowry likes children, although I have no reason to believe that she doesn't. But I do know that she respects them. And in my business, that's more important than anything else. In a career that has spanned 35 years and more than 30 books for children, she has never, not once, talked down to her readers. She has never shied away from difficult subjects because her readers were too young or too fragile. So her body of work includes Number the Stars, a book about the Holocaust for which she won the Newbery Medal, and she wrote about the death of a sibling in A Summer to Die. She has also written about the very real challenges of kids just trying to grow up in her Anastasia Krupnik novels. And she has taken on a subject near and dear to the heart of Washingtonians, the right and need to question authority, in her Giver series. That remarkable series comes to its conclusion with The Sun, Lowry's newest book, which will be available beginning of next month, right? Oh, I'm actually told that you can buy it today here. Woo! It is a privilege and a pleasure to present Lois Lowry.
Thank you. It actually hasn't legitimately been published yet, so if you buy it here today, you're ahead of the crowd. They gave us permission to make it available today to you guys for this special occasion. So that's the book I'm here to talk about. The title is Sun, and that's spelled S-O-N, not S-U-N. But in order to talk about it, I have to go back and back and back and talk first about The Giver. And thank you. The Giver was published in 1993, which means that I wrote it in 1992. And often I've been asked how I got the idea for the book. That's the question authors are most often asked. And sometimes we make up answers because we don't really know the answer. But one of the answers to that question is the fact that my father at that time was very old and his memory was beginning to fail. And so I was thinking a great deal about memory, about how it works and how it serves us, and how truthful it is or isn't. I think memory and two things, memory and dreams are two things that fascinate all of us because they're so individual, they're so much a part of us, and they're so mysterious at the same time. At any rate, I began to think about memory, and I began to think the way writers do with the phrase, what if? What if there were a way to control human memory? And that became the beginning of The Giver, a book about a group of people, I called them a community, who had found a way to do that. And then I realized in order to write about people who had found that way to do that, it would have to be set in the future. So the book became a futuristic novel, something I had never planned to write. Eventually it became known as a dystopian novel. Some people have called it science fiction, some people have called it fantasy. All of those are books the kind of books that I don't usually read, and yet suddenly I found myself writing one. When I got to the end of The Giver, in the writing of it, I left the ending ambiguous. I always thought of it as a happy ending, an optimistic ending, and it's an ending I would have liked as a kid reading that book. I would have liked using my imagination, maybe going on to create my own ending, write the story of what happened next. But what I discovered is that today's kids don't like ambiguity. Maybe that's because they're accustomed to TV shows that wrap everything up neatly before the last commercial. But at any rate, after the book was published, I began to get a lot of mail. First a trickle of mail, and then a lot of mail, and then a whole lot of mail. And that has continued. And a lot of what the mail said was, please explain the ending. What happened to Jonas at the end of the book? So that was on my mind, but I still hadn't thought about writing another book explaining that. I was, in fact, several books later and several years later, writing a completely different book with a main character who was a girl named Kira. And when I began to get to the ending of that book, I suddenly thought, hey, I could connect this to The Giver. And so at the end of the book, Gathering Blue, there is mention of a boy. His name is not mentioned. It was when I wrote it. It was in the manuscript, and the editor asked me not to name him. And so it's just a mention of a blue-eyed boy living in another place. Kids who loved The Giver and wondered about Jonas recognized him as Jonas, and so they knew he was alive and well. I thought that would be enough. It wasn't. But I found myself also fascinated by another character in the book, Gathering Blue. I always love my characters when I write about them. They begin to seem so real to me. But this was a little boy, and his name in Gathering Blue was Matt. And he was a bad boy. He didn't mean to be, but he lied and cheated and stole and did all the things bad boys do. But he was also very lovable and had a good heart. And so I began thinking about him, and I wrote the third book, called Messenger, in which he's the main character, now called Maddie. He's an adolescent, a teenager now in that third book. And Jonas is in the third book, and Kira is in the third book. And I thought, great, I've put them all together now, the end. And in fact, trilogy has a nice feel to it. It feels complete, and one of the publishers, the paperback publisher, even made a nice little boxed set. But something else happened. I don't know if you can see my shirt. It says, ask me about Gabe. Because the mail then changed its refrain, and the mail that came, and still does, is, but what happened to the baby? There's a baby named Gabe at the end of The Giver. And when I began to get that mail, I created a form letter that I used as a reply because the mail was so enormous in number. And my form letter said, go back and read Messenger again, or for the first time if you haven't read it yet, and read page 17, because there's a mention of a little boy named Gabe who is 8 years old. And it was clear that he was doing well. That, however, was not enough. And so finally, I found myself, because of the letters I'd gotten, emails mostly. Anybody can email me through my website. I found myself wondering the same thing. Okay, what about Gabe? What happens to him when he gets older? And because each of these books has a main character who is a young teenager, 14, perhaps 15. I don't think, in The Giver, the age is given. In the other books, it's unclear, but always a young teenager. And so I began thinking about Gabe as a young boy, and I began to write a book about him. And I started out describing him. He's probably 14. And always when you're writing a book, the main character has to have something that they want, some goal, some need, something that they're looking ahead to, and they're going to have trouble getting that, and that's why you turn the pages of a book. So I'm going to read you a brief few paragraphs from Son. But if you're looking closely, you see I've turned toward the end of the book. But this was what I had started out with. This was a book about Gabe. And here is a little conversation he's having with Jonas. Jonas, of course, is now an adult. It said it was Jonas who had brought him here years before when Gabe was just an infant. "Why did my parents let you take me?" he had asked. "You didn't have parents," Jonas explained. "Everybody has parents. Not in the place where we lived. Things were different there." "Well, how about you? Did you have parents?" "I had people I called mother and father," Jonas said. "I'd been assigned to them." "Well, what about me?" "Well, you hadn't been assigned yet. You were a bit of a problem." Gabe had grinned at that. He liked the idea of being troublesome. It seemed to give him a certain superiority. "I had to have parents, though," he said. "People don't just get born from nothing." "You know what, Gabe," Jonas said, "I was just a boy then. Babies appeared from the infant care building, and they were given to parents. I accepted it. I never knew anything else. I never asked where the babies had come from." Gabe had hooted with laughter. "Ha! Where do babies come from? Every kid asks that." Gabe was laughing, but Jonas looked serious and concerned. "You're right," he said slowly. "And I do remember that there were young girls chosen each year to be what was called birth mothers. They must have been the ones who... Well, what happened to the birth mothers? What happened to my birth mother?" "I don't know, Gabe." "Didn't she want me?" he asked. Jonas sighed. "I don't know, Gabe. It was a different system." "Well, I'm going to find out." "How?" Jonas asked. Gabe was young then, no more than 9, but he swaggered when he replied, "I'll go back there. You can't stop me. I'll find a way." So this was at the beginning of the book that was to be about Gabe and about his making the search to find his own origins. But as I was writing it, I found I was asking myself the same questions that he was asking. What about his mother? And I remembered writing about the birth mothers, the girls chosen at 12 for their future job, which would be to give birth to 3 babies, one after another, which would be assigned to sets of parents. And I began thinking about the girl who would have been Gabe's mother. And so I set this book that I was writing aside. That means in my computer, I made a folder and shoved it in there. And I opened up another folder and began to write again. And now I focused on the young girl. Her name is Claire. And the book begins, now I don't want to give too much away, but the book begins with Claire giving birth. And it doesn't go well. It's confusing, it's painful, again, I don't want to give too much away, but clearly something has gone wrong. And so shortly thereafter, she is summoned to the office of the place where the birth mothers live. And she's told that she's been decertified. She's no longer to be a birth mother. So I'm going to read you a little section, and now we're at the beginning of the book, okay? She asks the committee, they're talking to her, telling her she's been decertified, and they tell her it wasn't your fault, these things happen. And she asks them, what happened to my product, which is what they call what they give birth to. He looked at her dismissively, and then he relented. He turned to another committee member near him at the table and nodded to the papers in front of her, directing her to look up the information. What number was it? The woman asked him, but he ignored the question. Well, she said, I'll check by name. You're Claire, is it? As if they didn't know. They had summoned her here by name, but she nodded, yes, she was Claire. The woman moved her finger down a page. Yes, here you are. Product number 36. Oh, I see. Yeah, I see the notations about the difficulties. She looked up. Then she returned the paper to the pile and tapped the edges of the stack to make it tidy. He's fine, she said. The committee head glared at her. She corrected herself. I meant that it's fine. The medical difficulties didn't affect it. You'll be fine too, Claire, she said. Where am I going? Claire asked. Suddenly she was frightened. They hadn't yet said she was being reassigned, just decertified. So she would no longer be a birth mother. That made sense. Her body had not performed that function well. But what if decertified people were simply released the way failures often were? But their reply was reassuring. Fish hatchery, the committee head said. You're being moved there. They need help. They're short of workers. Your training will start in the morning. You'll have to catch up, but luckily you have a quick mind. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, and she went back to the dormitory to collect her things. She thought, as she packed the few personal items that she had. It was a he. I produced a baby boy. I had a son. The feeling of loss overwhelmed her. Now, I'm going to interrupt myself there to tell you about something not in the book, but related in a way to the book. Back in 1975, which is 37 years ago, I lived in Maine. I had 4 children. I was a housewife trying to be a writer. And suddenly the news, it was September, the news was all about a family who had gone camping in northern Maine. They were at a campsite, and they had a little boy. His name was Kurt. I think he was 4 years old. And one day that weekend that they were camping, the little boy wandered off and disappeared. The family, of course, searched and searched for him. The other people at the campsite searched, and then game wardens came in, and eventually it was police, state police, dogs, helicopters, and the search went on for day after day after day. And they never found any sign of that little boy. And I remember as a mother thinking, how could you pack up your things and go back home, not knowing? What would that be like, week after week, month after month, and eventually year after year, and now 37 years later, nobody ever found that child. What would it be like, I thought, for that mother? And so that was in my mind, I think, as I wrote about Claire, who has now lost her son, and who, a year later, if you've read The Giver, you know, she loses him a second time because, again, I don't want to ruin the plot of the book, but because she finds a way to keep track of him once she's out in the community working. She knows where he is in the child care center, and she sees him from time to time. Nobody realizes her relationship to him. And then when he's a year old, the boy, Jonas, takes the baby and flees, and so she has lost him a second time. So all of that happens in the beginning of the book when we're back in the community of the Giver, but seeing that community through the eyes of a different character. And then she spends the next 13 years looking for that child, and that's the whole middle section of the book. Now, again, I'm not going to tell you details, but it does raise this question of what would a mother, having suffered such a loss, what would she be willing to sacrifice to find her son? Because that's a decision that Claire has to make at the end of section 2 of this book. And of course, we all know the answer. She would give anything. And in fact, she does. She has to. And so the second section ends with her making that terrible decision. And then the third section begins with Gabe as a 14-year-old boy. So I think I've told you enough about the book because I don't want you not to read it. And so I can't just tell you every detail. But I will tell you that the reason this book is considerably fatter than the other 3 books that precede it is because I had to cover 14 years. And I also had to deal with all the characters. Jonas is a major character here. Kira is. Gabe, of course, and the new character, Claire. I would like to think that by the time this book ends, all the questions have been answered. And yet I know that somebody down the line, I'm going to get an email, it's going to say, yes, but what about, and they'll think of some obscure character. What about him? What about her? But I think I'm through with this group of books now. And quartet has a nice ring to it, as trilogy did. So there it is. And now I have time to answer your questions. So I'm sure there are lots of them, and there's some mechanism for people. Here they come to the microphone. So let's do this. Okay.
Hi, I've heard it said that fantasy enables readers to face reality, and so I wondered what your thoughts were about that.
Her question is that she has heard, perhaps you heard her because she has a mic, but she has read or heard that fantasy enables readers to face reality, and she wonders my thoughts about that. That's a pretty tough question. But I think surely it's true. Why do we read fantasy, or why do we write it? It's a way of disguising reality, I think. It's a way of hiding things sometimes that are very tough. And so it's a back door into facing real issues. And it's a way, a book like this or the ones that precede it are a way of promoting discussion about real issues. As The Giver teachers, I know there are many teachers in the audience, have found that reading The Giver promotes a lot of discussion about issues that face kids today. Thank you. Okay, where's the other? Okay, here it is.
Hi, I just want to say thank you. I feel that today I'm meeting one of my idols. You've moved me. You are the reason I'm here today.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
I loved A Summer to Die. I learned about goldenrods. I learned about photography. I learned about the relationship of two siblings. Your books ring so true. And the best thing for me, The Giver, Number the Stars, you find a way to make those human connections that touch the soul. That's all I can say. Thank you.
Thank you. That was not a question, but it was lovely to hear that. Thank you. Okay, we'll go back to this side.
Hi, I was wondering what led you to write Number the Stars, and thank you for writing that because my father was a Holocaust survivor, and I think that we all have to remember that period of time.
Number of the Stars was written back in 1989 at a time when I had a very close friend, a woman my age, she died this spring, who had, though I knew her in this country, she had been born and brought up in Denmark, in Copenhagen. And one time she and I were talking, we were very close, and we were talking about our childhoods and the fact that I had lost an older sister, and so had she. The book A Summer to Die, to which she just referred, was about the death of my older sister. And my older sister had died of cancer. My friend Annalisa's sister, she told me, had died newly married, expecting a baby, had died in childbirth, along with the child. And I was astonished by that because Denmark is not a third world country. It's a country with a very sophisticated medical care system. And the fact that a young woman had died in childbirth was shocking to me. And I said that to her. And she said, well, she said it was during the war. It was during the German occupation. We had very poor medical care and we had very poor nutrition. And then she went on to tell me about what had happened in Denmark in 1943. I think I had probably read about that or learned about it in a history course, but I hadn't remembered it. And it is such a wonderful story, the events in 1943 in Denmark, that I thought it would be a good story if I could find a way to tell it to kids so that they would remember it, as I had not. And so I created the characters in the book. I did a lot of research, but I created the characters based on my friend's family and wrote about the fact that in 1943, under the occupation of the Nazis, the order came down from Nazi headquarters in Germany that they were to take the Jews into captivity, and they had brought a ship, this isn't in the book, but they had brought a ship into Copenhagen harbor, and they were going to take all the Jews of Denmark by ship back to Germany to the camps. And there was one man who was high up in the German echelon who was so appalled by this that he went and told the Danish government. And so they knew in advance. And then the amazing thing that happened was that the Christian population of Denmark hid their Jewish population, 7,000 people. And so when that night came, just this time of year, I think it was September 23rd, Rosh Hashanah, just passed here, when the knocks came on the door of all the Jewish people's homes and apartments in Denmark, mostly in Copenhagen, but throughout Denmark, they found all those houses and all those apartments empty because the Jews had been taken into hiding by their Christian neighbors and friends. There were many, many stories that I learned from that time, and of course I couldn't include them all in the book. But the story that I told, I think, was enough to make kids aware of the fact that people can rise up with integrity and with honor, as they did in Denmark in 1943. Thank you.
You probably get this question all the time, so sorry if you're repeating yourself, but for a budding writer who's trying to finish their first novel, what would be your number one piece of advice?
A budding writer trying to finish her first novel, what would be my piece of advice? I am asked that question a lot from budding writers in all states, not trying to finish their first novel, but trying to start their first novel. And it's a very hard question to answer, partly because I was once that young person wanting to be a writer. And I think what I was doing was what you're doing and what all budding writers are doing. And that is writing and writing and writing and reading and reading and reading. And there's no real bits of advice that can go beyond that. Those are the important things you have to do. What kind of computer to have, it used to be what kind of pen should you use. Those things don't matter. And all that matters is that you want to write. And the more you do, the better you get, one hopes. And sometimes it's helpful, though this has not been helpful to me, but I do find for young people, it's sometimes helpful to find other kids or young people who have the same interest and to share their writing and talk about it and help each other out. I don't do that. I don't like doing that, and it doesn't work for me. I'm a very solitary writer. Nobody sees what I'm working on until it's finished. And then the editor sees it and tells me it isn't finished, and I go back and work on it some more. But I don't have any special little hints. I'm sorry. I wish I did. Some writers fake it and make up crazy things, but none of that matters. What matters is to keep at it, I think. Somebody has said the important thing is to have your butt in the chair at the desk when the idea comes. Because the ideas are out there, but if you're not there writing them down, they go away and they go to somebody else. Okay, yes.
Hi, I teach 8th grade English, and thank you.
Those are either all your students, or they're just a general population that loves 8th grade English?
And the irony is my students this weekend are spending it writing an epilogue to The Giver.
Okay, and is that going to ruin it for them that I've...
Well, I'm going to share with them what you said, but only after we read theirs out loud. And I did ask them, I had great respect yesterday when I told them, guess where I'm going tomorrow, and guess who I'm going to talk to. And I said, if I could ask her one question, what would you want me to ask? Well, at least half of them wanted me to ask, can you come to their school?
And the answer is no,
I said, that's
sorry.
putting her on the spot a little bit. And one young lady said, ask her when she looks back over her career what she's most proud of.
That's an interesting question, and I don't think I've been asked it in that form before. And interestingly, it wouldn't have anything to do with the books I've written. I think the thing I'm most proud of, I'm 75 years old, so looking back 75 years, what am I most proud of? My children. Wouldn't any mother say that? Yeah. And now I'm going to tell you, sorry you guys who are waiting, but I'm going to tell you another story that relates to that and also relates to this new book. When my son, his name was Gray, family name, was 14 years old, he had a best friend. They had the same birthday, March 3rd. They always celebrated their birthday together. And when the boys were 13, they played on a hockey team together. And my son mentioned to me that his friend, whose name was Lee, was falling down all the time. And Lee was a fabulous skater, so this was unusual. And to make a long story short, it turned out that Lee had a brain tumor. And Lee died around the time of their 14th birthday. It's sometime after that, I moved away. Lee's parents, though I knew them, were not close friends of mine, and I didn't stay in touch with them. I moved away to a different place. Years passed. My son grew up, married, had a child, and when my son was 36 and his little girl was 2, my son was killed in an accident. And so I went to his funeral in the town where he had grown up. And a woman came up to me afterward and reintroduced herself, and it was Lee's mother. And here's what she told me, that every year on the boy's birthday, March 3rd, my son, how many years would that be, from age 14 to 36? I'm not quick at math, but for all those years, every year my son had written her a letter. And that told me something about my son I had not known and was glad to hear. But it also, in relation to the book, told me something about a woman who loses a son. In this case, she knows her son is alive somewhere. Lee's mother and I know that that isn't true. But nonetheless, year after year after year, we wonder, what would he be doing now? My son's little girl is graduating from high school this year. And so I think about how he would feel about that. You just don't lose that bond with your child, though the child is gone. And that's what propels the young woman in this book to keep going. Thank you.
Okay, I was just wondering, is Jonas, is he based on someone you know, or was it just someone you wished you knew?
She says, is Jonas based on somebody I know, or is he based on somebody I wished I knew? Almost all of my book characters are made-up characters. They're not specifically anybody I know, except for a couple of books that are autobiographical. There's a book called Autumn Street, in which the young girl protagonist is me at that age. Gave her a different name, though. So Jonas is a made-up character. But when a writer makes up a character, you draw on all the people you know. And so when I make up a 12-year-old boy like Jonas, I am drawing on my own sons when they were 12. And now my son Ben would hate me for telling you this, but he's not here, so don't tell him I told you this. Do you remember in the book The Giver, Jonas, who's about to be 12, tells his parents about a dream that he's had. And his parents say, oh, he's experiencing the stirrings, he must take these pills. And the pills are some kind of hormone that takes away any romantic feelings. I remember my son Ben at that age, he was probably 13, coming into the kitchen after school, dropping his school books on the kitchen table, and usually he would grab his baseball glove and go outside. But instead he kept hanging around the kitchen. Everywhere I turned, there he was. And finally I said, Ben, what's wrong? And he said, I like girls. Stirrings. So in that sense, when I created the character of a 12-year-old boy, I was drawing on my son and my other son. And I have grandsons now, though they were babies when the book was written. No, they weren't even born when the book was written. But every 12-year-old boy I know. And so in that sense, a book character is never entirely fictional. It comes from many places, and all of them are real. Yes?
Okay, I'm going to make this really quick since I know that there are lots of other people that want questions.
Okay.
In The Giver, you talk about lots of complex feelings because these people haven't really experienced things like love and things that we have now. So how did you go about writing that, and how did you feel when you were writing that? How was that experience for you?
he's describing the fact that in the book The Giver, the people have lost the capacity to feel any deep feelings. And so that's the reason they have no literature and no art and no music, because all of those things arrive out of human emotions. Did I say arrive? I meant arise, out of human emotions, out of feeling love and grief and all of those things. So how did I write about people who didn't experience that, and who, you find out gradually, also don't see color? They've lost that as well. It was very difficult, and I re-experienced that when I wrote the first section of this new book, which is set in the same community. So I was plunged back into that world, and I remembered how hard it was. For example, I was describing this young girl living in the place where the birth mothers are housed as they wait to give birth, and then they give birth, and then they wait around and have another baby. And I realized, what do? They don't have any books to read. They can't listen to music. It was very, very boring. And so I got through that part of the book very quickly. I moved her out of there, but still the community is without any of the things that give us great pleasure, which arises out of emotions. So it was tough, and I guess that's the best answer I have for you. You asked how was it to write that? It was very hard. Okay, thank you. Yes?
How do you find ideas to write most of your books?
How do I find ideas to write most of my books? Ideas come from all sorts of different places, and the best place, of course, is from your own imagination. But sometimes your imagination is triggered by things. You might read an article in the newspaper, or you might hear a story told by somebody else. You might see something happen. Say you're driving down the road with your parents and looking out the window, and you see two people having an argument, but then you've passed and you've gone on. So then your imagination takes over, and you wonder what the argument was about, and you make something up. You say, well, what if it was this? What if it was that? Some things lend themselves to stories more than others. But always, if you ask yourself the question, what if, that's where a story begins. Some of my stories come from my own past, A Summer to Die, Autumn Street, things that happened in my childhood. And if you look back, and even though I don't know how old you are, but say you're 10 or 8 or 12, you still have a number of years of past. And if you look back at your own earlier years, looking for something to make a story from, here's what you look for. You look for some event that created a strong emotion. Either you were very scared, or you were very happy, or you were very angry, and about the things that were taking place. And that's the beginning of a story. And the important thing is that at the end of the story, you have to have changed in some way. Otherwise, there's no reason to write the story. That's where ideas come from. Okay, next.
Did you ever start writing a book and figured out you didn't have enough ideas to finish it?
Did I ever start writing a book and didn't finish it? I have some book starts that I haven't finished, but I have to add the word yet, because I don't throw them away if I set them aside. Maybe the time isn't right for me to finish that book. Maybe it requires more thought. Maybe it requires research, which I don't enjoy. And so I set it aside, and then I go back to it. And there are a number of books of mine published which I had started and set aside. And then maybe a year later or 5 years later, I'll look again at it and say, oh, and it will trigger some new thoughts, some new imagination. So the important thing is not to throw it away. Even though Stephen King, who is a neighbor of mine in the summer, says that his first book, Carrie, some of you will remember that, he had started and thrown away. And his wife found it in the wastebasket and read the crumpled pages and suggested he finish it, which he did, and of course it became a famous book and movie. I would kill anybody that looked through my wastebasket, I'll tell you that right now. If it's in my wastebasket, it's because it's waste and it's going to stay there till I take it to the dump. But usually I don't throw something away. I save it and go back to it. Okay, this side.
What inspired you to be an author?
What inspired me to be an author? When I was your age, which I'm guessing is, let me guess, 9? No? Tell me. 8. Okay, I was very close. When I was your age, 8, writing was what I loved best in school. Reading was what I loved most. And from that very earliest time, I wanted to be a writer. I never, ever wanted to be anything else. And when I grew up and went to college, I majored in writing. But then I did something that often women did in the 1950s. I dropped out of college when I was 19 and I got married. I was very creative, though. I just set my creativity in another direction. I had a baby when I was 21. I had a baby when I was 22. I had a baby when I was 24. I had a baby when I was 25. And then finally, after my kids got older, I went back to writing. Okay, yes.
So
our time is almost up, by the way.
I grew up on your Anastasia books, which were full of all those great domestic details.
Yeah.
And then was excited to read your Giver series, which is much more spare. And then to see that you'd moved on also to the Goonie Bird books, which are sort of cluttered again with all those fun details. And I just wondered how you develop such different voices and what it feels like to toggle back and forth between them.
I never work on 2 books at the same time, so I go from one kind of book to another kind usually, and that's to keep myself from getting bored. If I were to continue writing the same kind of book again and again and again, I would get tired of it, I think. And so it's a diversion for me to go on. I've just finished a new Goonie Bird book. This was the last serious book that I finished, and then this summer I wrote another in the Goonie Bird series. I don't know what I'll do next, but it will be something different. I won't go on to write another Goonie Bird until 2 books down the line. It's just a way of keeping myself interested in what I'm doing. Okay, 2 more questions.
What inspired you to write about the Holocaust?
I think I answered that question pretty much when I described how my friend told me about Denmark and what had happened in Denmark. And the Holocaust of something, let me start again. One time I was in an audience, speaking to an audience of a lot of people, like here, and a man stood up, and I was talking about Number of the Stars. And he stood up and he said, "Why do we have to tell this story over and over again?" And I thought it's a story that is so important that we must tell it over and over again. My daughter-in-law, my son's wife, is German, and she says, in Germany, they tell the story of the Holocaust too. My granddaughter has grown up in German schools, and they tell it there. And they should tell it everywhere, because if we forget something like that, it's like the world of The Giver, where they've forgotten every bad thing that ever happened and makes it more likely that it will happen again. Okay, you're the final question. Oh, this better be good.
I hope it is good. I was wondering, because you said earlier that you were satisfied with the end of The Giver because it left it up to the imagination, and you were all about that, an advocate for that. So how did you stay motivated in writing for a generation that's more accustomed to instant gratification? How do you stay motivated to accommodate that?
Well, I think what happens is when you're writing a book, when a writer is writing a book, and you've created these characters, and they're fictional, and you know they're fictional, nonetheless, they begin to seem very, very real to you. And so when a book ends, when you finish writing it and you type the end, it's like closing the door of a house where you've lived for a long time with a family you're close to and moving on to something else. And you still remember them, and you still wonder a bit about them. And so when you go back and reopen the door and find them changed and different, somehow the feeling of their being real comes back to you and energizes you. That's been true for me, at least. Okay, that was the last question. Thank you all.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.